Happy to be here. Thanks, Sans, for putting this on. People at home or work, wherever you're streaming this, welcome. Hope you're enjoying the conference so far. So let's see if this thing works. Okay, cool, it does. So there's the title of my slide deck and my talk. We don't really need to dive into that too much. As Jean just said, I am Christopher Peacock. You can call me Chris. I have experience pretty much on all things blue side. Dabble in the red side because that's important to know the red side if you're a blue teamer. And I have a history of network engineering, SOC, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, also incident response. You can read the rest. I do have some GX certifications as well, but you're not here to listen to me talk about myself. You're here to see what I have to say about purple teaming. So one of the things that we get to when we want to talk about purple teaming is what the current state is right now. And what the current state is we have a bunch of silos. With the blue team, we're over there, we're monitoring our alerts, we're doing our configurations that we need to do. But if something comes out that's new, we're not really testing it. If we're starting to see what the payload's doing that's hitting our email gateway, we're not really going in and saying, hey, what happens if that actually gets through? What will that look like? Can we actually alert on it? Because guess what? Some of that stuff is going to eventually get through and it's going to trip. So we saw this like a lot of the times lately. It's been coming through with ISOs and a link file inside the ISOs. So can you actually go out and test that? And that's where we get to purple teaming more. But the blue's just operating kind of in a silo, and they're not actually validating what's coming, what alerts would come off of such activity. And then if you're lucky enough to have a red team, I know a lot of organizations still don't even have a red team. And that's why Atomic Red Team is great if you're just starting out and you don't have an internal red team yet. But the red team's often operating in a silo as well, right? They're coming up there and they're saying, hey, I got to the domain controller, I own the domain, I'm the best red teamer ever, you didn't detect me. Well, I hate to break it to you, but honestly, who's usually signing that employment check for the red team? Most of the time, it's coming from the CISO's office or the CIO, right? They're built under that umbrella. So we're all on the same team, but we're acting like we're on two separate teams. This is not good for security of the organization. And then from there, we have the CTI team. They're doing their thing often. They're going out, they're gathering those IOCs. They're not really talking necessarily to the blue team, right? A lot of times we see where the CTI team is gathering those IOCs, and then they're saying, hey, we're going to feed those to the blue team SIM, and that's where we call it a day. Well, they're just IOCs. Yeah, it's great that we check to make sure we don't have them, but whatever happened in that organization over there with their IOCs, the attacker's not going to use those in my organization when they come over and hit me. So that's one of the things that we have to focus on of how can we actually get these three teams working together to do purple teaming and actually help our organization do what they need to do. So why purple team? Well, we want to talk about testing defenses. And when we talk about testing defenses, like I said, if I actually have a link that comes in on an ISO, or, if I have someone trying to use Mimikatz in my environment or PowerShell, for the longest time, people could just PowerShell throughout environments because the blue teamers didn't know that PowerShell was a threat. But we have to go in there. We actually have to test our defenses. Oftentimes during this phase, what we're learning is, okay, do we actually block execution? If we want to do a DLL, run DLL32, execute a malicious DLL, are our defenses actually going to pick that up or not? The other thing too is, does it trip a low-level alert, or does it actually get to an analyst, eyes on screen actually seeing the activity? So we have to know all these things, and that's one of the things that Purple Teams allows us to do. The other thing is we can also test processes, people, processes, technology. The processes are huge. And one of the things that we often test here is handoffs. We want to test different handoffs. Maybe it's SOC transitioning from one shift to another. Maybe it's going from tier 1 to tier 2. Maybe it's going from SOC to incident response. We can test a bunch of different processes. Maybe when we're doing our purple teaming, we actually find out that, hey, we have an alert that's really noisy and we never respond to it. And this activity is tripping that alert. So now we actually have to do a new process where we kick it over to detection engineering to tune that alert so that we can get higher fidelity and actually generate a response. So we want to test those processes. That's huge. The other area that we want to talk about is training defenders. All right, so I used to coach football. I was a defensive coordinator. I loved it. It was fun. I always got to have a sparring partner, and that's why I love where I work right now. I have awesome, amazing red teamers, sparring partners. But one of the things that always kind of, made me wonder was why we don't actually scrimmage in cyber. Oftentimes when I was doing football, you know what I would do? I would watch the other team. I would literally go to the games that they were playing. I would get film on the other team. I would draw up all of their plays, and I would have a scout team replicate those plays against my defense. And we would practice and we'd practice. And then finally, when game time came, we would actually be ready for that opponent, or at least hopefully. I like to think I did a good enough job as a DC to prep them. So that's one of the things is when I came into security, I said, why are we not scrimmaging? So that's where I really love Purple Team, because we get to do that scrimmage. It's so much fun to me as a defender. I love actually working with the red team. And then finally, when we put all this together, we're really actually improving security. We know where we stand, we know where we have gaps, and we can actually conduct improvement. And that's one of the best things about it is improving. Maybe when we do that Purple Team engagement, we find out that we only tripped 3 low-level alerts. Well, if those low-level alerts never fire in the environment for anything else, well, now I can actually raise those because they have high fidelity. I can raise them and generate an actual incident off of whenever they fire. So that's great. Next is things that we shouldn't do or try to do from a Purple Team perspective. Oftentimes people say, hey, can you actually exploit your way in? We're not here to do, as Purple Teamers, vulnerability validations. That's just not really part of the Purple Team process. Also, one of the things too, when we're talking about Purple Teaming is, we want to actually not necessarily do the exploitation because that's going to introduce unknowns and it can also crash systems in production. So what we'd rather do is we actually want to figure out, okay, if this exploit is used, what would it look like? So, if someone's going to exploit Apache, what process spawns off if that vulnerability is actually used? We can go replicate that. Great. The other thing is it's not designed to replace a pen test. A Purple Team shouldn't go out and scan your entire perimeter and try to find a way in from your perimeter. That's a separate thing. It's not here to replace a pen test. They have their place where they belong, and it's not a pen test. So don't try to just replace the two and say like, oh, Purple Teaming is a pen test that we can win because we have blue eyes on it. All right, don't do that. The other thing is it's not here to conduct AV or EDR research. Sometimes people come in and they say, hey, I always want to conduct in block mode. And it's like, okay, well, so you want us to sit here for a week and you want us to try to execute and bypass your EDR. That's not what Purple Teaming's for. If you want someone just to sit there and research how to bypass your EDR, you can find someone to do that, but that's not Purple Teaming. Just know that. So what that leads us to is we want to assume breach. And the biggest thing this really comes down to is the cost. We can spend a week trying to fish our way in, but you're paying for experts to be there to try to fish their way in when we know we have proven in our phishing reports that we already do as an organization that, anywhere roughly around 20% of people or whatever your number is for your organization, someone will click the link. Someone will download the thing. We know that's going to happen. So let's just go ahead. Let's not spend that extra money and let's actually do an assumed breach. Phishing works. Oftentimes, if you need other excuses, what happens if there's an insider threat? What was it? There was someone at Tesla who was trying to get paid off to plug in a USB. There's things like this that do happen. What happens if the adversary uses a 0-day? Don't tell us that we should use a 0-day though, because you know what's going to happen? If someone is on a purple team developing a 0-day, hopefully they're going and selling that for some money instead of actually using it and burning it on your engagement, because 0 days are actually worth money. All right, you can go to Zerodium, Zerodium, however you want to pronounce it. You can go there and you can actually look up how much a 0-day is going for. And I can tell you that's probably more, it's going to be more expensive than whatever someone's charging you for a purple team engagement where they assume breach. The other thing is, we oftentimes we have misconfigurations. So something could happen, what happens if someone actually slaps RDP open to the internet? Things happen, misconfigurations happen. We're all human. Hopefully those things don't happen, but that's why we assume breach still. The other thing that could also happen is you could already be breached. So those are just some things to consider. All right, thankfully that's not cut off because it's cut off down here, but over there it looks good. So purple teaming process, I think you ran into that. Purple teaming process, we get new CTI. That's going to kick off what we actually are going to conduct. So then we want to go in, we want to organize that. We want to organize the observations from the CTI that we're gathering. And we need procedure level CTI, and we'll get into that more later. From there, we want to kick it off into a tabletop discussion. This is where we make sure that everything works. Finally, we're going to emulate the attack, and then that then generates detection engineering so that we can actually cover those gaps. We have actually some papers on this. George Orchias wrote a whole framework on this. I'll share it later, the link, but it's definitely a great thing to have. And it's a framework. When I share it later, it is a framework. George used to work at Citi. They have a large resource budget, so it's a framework. Adapt it to your needs and see how it fits your organization. So one of the areas we want to talk about, though, is being threat informed. We like to think that purple teaming should be threat informed, right? Because you shouldn't go out there and you shouldn't test. If you are a K through 12 school, you shouldn't be worried what North Korea is doing to South Korea. That's not in your threat profile, right? But if ransomware actors are targeting K through 12 schools, that's in your threat profile. So let's start with what you should be concerned about. From there, we need to gather intelligence. And when I say intelligence, we need to figure out what they're actually doing, how they're doing it. If you just give me a MITRE attack technique ID, that's not good enough because I still don't know how they're doing it. And then we map those procedures to technique IDs. And then that's when we analyze and organize it. We create a plan with our red team. And then finally, we're emulating the adversary. One thing I often get asked is prioritizing threats. One of the great resources is from Andy Piazza. It's ThreatBox. If you've never seen this before, it's a great tool to have. You can actually prioritize threats. So when someone says, hey, what should we do first when we want to do purple team? Oh, well, we should do this actor because they have the greatest intent and the greatest capability. So that means they're our greatest threat. So it's a great resource to have. If you've never seen this before, you might have been living under a rock slightly for, I don't know, the past however many years this has been going on. If you're new to cyber, I understand maybe you haven't seen it before. David Bianco's Pyramid of Pain, though, what he's talking about here is that different values are easier to change than others. So we see that hashes are trivial to change. Every time you're downloading a payload, it's pretty trivial to change the hash. IPs, domain names, that's all automated now. So easy to change. But at the top, he put TTPs. He recently did a talk, I believe it was B-Sides Augusta, where he said, you know what, back in the day, TTPs was the hot word, but what I really wish I would have put up at the top is behaviors. He really said that we should focus on behaviors, and that's what he wishes he would have put at the top of it. So from a purple teaming perspective, we shouldn't do IOC validation checks. That's not really a purple team thing. Is that necessary in blue team? Yes, your blue team should validate that all those mechanisms and that process is working, but it's not necessarily part of a purple team. We want to focus on the top of this pyramid at those procedures, at those behaviors where we can actually go beyond what our stock solutions are doing and actually get to the EDR and the SIM and tune it for our environment. And the other thing that I want to touch on is getting to procedures. If you tell me that the actor did credential access for tactics, I don't know how they did it. If you tell me they dumped LSAS, I say, great, but how? You know, here we actually see the actor used proc dump to do it, okay? This is important because recently Microsoft went out, they actually tested 11 different ways of dumping LSAS. They only blocked 8. That's why procedures matter. We have to test at a procedure level. And the other area to focus on too of why this is important and they don't change as much is because of humans are behind attacks. You know, they have certain training, they have certain tools. If it's a large organization, like if it's, you know, the PLA, the Army for China, you know, it's going to take them a while to actually have approved actions that they can actually take on your network. You know, they have run books. Conti, for instance, in this one, they actually, the DFA reports, they're great, by the way. Definitely recommend checking them out. But the actor actually copied and pasted the script and didn't fill in the IPv4 address space. I was talking to Jake Williams before. We were doing a talk, and he said, you know what? One time I had an actor come in, they kept mistyping a command. They kept misspelling it the same way every time. So they actually wrote a detection rule for that, and they were like, oh, there's that actor again who always misspells that. So procedures do matter. And honestly, we are awful as a security industry of catching procedures. And this is the proof of it, is because of Mandiant, the APT1 report. If you look, that's the same procedures that Conti was actually using. The same procedures nearly a decade later, and they still work and they still get past defenses without actually raising an IR. So that tells you that we're not doing a good job of actually focusing on procedures. We've been too heavy on, oh, AV catches malware, and then we remove the malware. Well, that hasn't been working. So we got to focus on these procedures. We have to know our environment and how to have tripwires in it for them. One of the other things too, and I've kind of touched on this, is procedure mapping, and with techniques, it's kind of a one-way function. So here we see the procedures that were used by the adversary and reported by the DFA report. Those go over to the technique IDs. That's how mapping to MITRE works. Now, one of the issues that happens is people try to take the technique IDs from MITRE. If you give me that, I don't know how that's actually being conducted. I can't go down. It's a one-way function of observations to technique IDs. It's very hard to go down the other way. One of the ways we often see this misused is people will go to MITRE attack. Great, I love MITRE attack. They'll then click, you know, an APT group, APT1. They're not really in operation anymore because of reorganization within PLA. But anyways, we'll still use APT1 for this example. So then they see what technique IDs have been used. In this example, let's say process discovery. So then they'll go out, they'll grab the atomic test that maps to that technique ID, and then they'll run it. But what if they did one of the other atomic tests and we didn't test those? Or what if they use native API and that's not even in atomic? So we run into issues where we have these false coverages, so to speak, because we're running certain emulations. You know, we've grabbed something from attack. Hey, T1057. We tested T1057. But guess what? Did you actually test the thing that the adversary does? And that's one of the big downfalls is people are just replacing it with whatever matches because the technique IDs match. And that's not how you're actually going to validate your security posture. So what does this look like? You know, if I get this report from Microsoft, I see a few things here that I can go ahead and check. Okay, the adversary is using MSHTA or MSHTA, depending upon how you want to call it. You know, if you really are big into MSHTA and you want me to change my ways, we can talk over some beverages later. But I typically go MSHTA. Anyways, we can check to see, hey, that's making a call out. All right, now I know as a red teamer, let me replicate that. Blue team, do you get an alert on that? Boom, we've already taken CTI at a procedure level. We made it actionable. Another example, we can do who am I execution, and we can output it to a text file. So these are these are the things that we can start thinking about. All right, we're seeing the adversary do this. We know it's in their operations. Let's test it. One of the other areas that we need to touch on too is adversary capabilities to emulation capabilities. If you can't execute the same procedure, then can you slightly tweak it? That's one thing to consider. The other thing to consider is, can you adapt it to your environment? So if you get CTI that says, hey, the adversary is turning off Windows Defender, but you don't have Windows Defender, all right, well, how do they turn off, my AV or EDR? That's something to consider. And then the other thing that we want to talk about is, how do we actually operationalize this with detection engineering? So from here, we've gone out, we've gotten the CTI, we did the red team. Then we're going to kick off the actual detection engineering cycle, and that's step 5. So after we emulate the attack, we know what's been missed. And from there, we have our direction as detection engineers to go out, collect those logs, process them, develop a new alert, or tune the alerts that we do have, and then we can disseminate it back out. By the way, Palantir, I think it's the alerting detection. I'll have to post the Slack later, but or Discord. But anyways, Palantir has a great framework for alerting and detection. I definitely recommend checking that out. But this is what direction kind of looks like. If you're just doing this, if you don't have a formal process set up, maybe you have a few procedures that you're going to run through. You can see what alerted, what didn't. You see here we have a lot of alert gaps. We were using a certain EDR just to test, and we see that a lot of these didn't have alerts. And we really want to detect these, because maybe what happens if an adversary comes in and they run 3 of these again, and they don't run 2 that alerted. So we need to actually have better coverage. One of the areas too is the threat understanding is a huge driver in detections. So where this comes in with red team and CTI is that the CTI is going to have that threat understanding. And then that has to drive the red team. The red team has to have that threat understanding. And then finally at the end, it leads to the blue team finally having that threat understanding of what the adversary is doing, because now we actually have the logs. We have, the alerts that are generated. We have the logs that we can then process. We know what we're up against as far as blue team. By the way, document any sort of visibility gaps. And that also goes with the data collection. And so from there, with the data collection, we have 2 areas of data collection. We have what data are we actually collecting. The detect framework has been mentioned multiple times today. It is amazing, but by no means should you go, this square is blue, we're safe from that square. Don't do that with the attack framework and detect, because yes, it means that you have visibility, but it doesn't mean that it will ever trip an alert and get in front of the eyes of a SOC analyst. Okay, so that's the biggest thing that we need to get to, is actually making sure that we have an alert for that procedure in front of a human being worked appropriately. That's the other thing we talked about earlier. Process is key. You can go in, I've seen it before, and someone picks up an alert. Okay, Mimikatz on a domain controller. All right, AV removed Mimikatz. Okay, cool. They closed the case. No one stopped to think, why is Mimikatz on a domain controller? How did it get there? It was just alert, remove it. So that's what we were talking about earlier. Scrimmage. Make sure you get out there and you actually have these scrimmages and you test those processes and you train. And the big driver of it is the red team. That's why I love working with amazing red teamers, because they make blue better. Finally, by the way, one thing to mention here with the detection drivers is the operational capability. And what that is oftentimes, you'll have a tool that just doesn't work well, and that can hinder your operational tempo. So you need tools and you need trained people. The people are the most important part, because without them, you're not going to get anything done. And then you have to have those tools as well. Oftentimes we go into purple team engagements and they want to do detection engineering, but the EDR doesn't even let them tune custom rule sets because they don't have that premium feature turned on. So that's something to consider when you're doing purple team engagements, is can you even go in and deploy your custom rules? I like to say EDRs are kind of like a suit. You can go get a suit off the rack, you know, and it's meant to fit a bunch of different people, but it's not tailored to you. You have to tailor your EDR. When you go into an environment as a red teamer, oftentimes you know what that environment's going to have as far as the EDR. If you are actually a nation state, you might even know what alerts are tripped for what procedures you run. But the thing that they never know is what custom alerts you built into there. And when you do that, you are laying enough landmines that hopefully they step on one. So I like to say, lay as many landmines as you can, or as many tripwires as you can. So with that, we have some templates. These are free and open source. They're on our GitHub. With this, one of the big things I always like to talk about first is cite your CTI source. When you're doing this, if you're coming up and if you're a red teamer or if you're a CTI analyst, cite your CTI source, because what's going to end up happening, especially if you're a consultant, people will say, well, they'll never do that. They will tell you that adversary would never do that. And then that's when you can go and you can say, well, here's the report where they did that. So always cite your source. That's one of the key things here. One of the areas I do wish that we actually swapped around was you fill in the procedure side first, and then you map the procedure to the technique and then to the tactic. That's one other thing to mention. And then also document your emulation procedure, because did you make adjustments? Because this matters. You want to know that. So from there, the other area that we'll touch on too is the Purple Team exercise framework. It's free and open source. I actually got a text from my friend the other day. I'm not going to name the company that he's at, but like Fortune 100 company. And he was like, hey man, I actually use this framework. It's been amazing. I can't believe that y'all just published this. Like, George did a fantastic job with it. So I highly recommend this. If you are spinning up a Purple Team at all, definitely check out this framework. If you're doing Purple Team engagements at all, definitely check out this framework. It's a great framework. Adapt it for your organization though.